Hello, thank you for being with us. I'm Hanscom Smith. I'm an associate at the Freeman Chair of China Studies here at CSIS. Jude Blanchette unfortunately can't be with us today because he has COVID, but I'm happy to be joined here first by Thomas Kellogg, Adjunct Professor of Law and Executive Director at the Georgetown Center for Asian Law, and Yaqiu Wang, Research Director for China at Freedom House. And we're discussing the importance and the potential implications of Article 23 and national security legislation in Hong Kong. And Tom, maybe we can start by discussing why is this important and why are we looking at this now, and what's the Hong Kong context for Article 23?
Sure. Well, first, Hanscom, I want to thank you and I want to thank CSIS for this opportunity to talk about this very important development in Hong Kong. And I would say, if you look at the totality of their basic law, Article 23 national security law proposals, this is the wrong law at the wrong time. As you know, as both of you know, this has been a long time coming. We have Article 23 of the Hong Kong Basic Law, their mini constitution, which does put the onus on Hong Kong to pass national security legislation. And there was an initial failed attempt back in 2003, which actually was sort of a jumpstart moment for the pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong. Fast forward to 2019 and the pro-democracy protests there. That then led to the 2020 central government national security law, which has been used as a tool to crack down on human rights and rule of law in Hong Kong. Adding to that, with this new national security legislation, with new laws that can be used to target human rights activists, I think is a big mistake, and I'm sure we'll get into some of those details.
Okay. Yaqiu, I know you've been following Hong Kong for many years, so what's your perspective on why we're seeing implementation of Article 23 now? As Tom said, this was originally proposed as part of the Basic Law, Hong Kong's de facto constitution, back in 2003.
Well, I think this is just the latest effort and stage of the Chinese government wanting more control over Hong Kong. It failed to get it enacted in 2003, and then there was the national security law. This is the government, probably felt, 3.5 years have passed. We need something new to continue to carry out the Beijing's mission of more control over Hong Kong.
So I was the United States Consul General in Hong Kong from 2019 to 2022. That period coincided with not just the protest movement of 2019, but also the imposition of the national security law in 2020. So how is the Article 23 legislation different from or related to Article 23?
I would say, and I'm sure Yaqiu wants to chime in on this as well, I would say what you're seeing is a rolling out of an ever more expansive toolkit for the government to, as Yaqiu said, maintain control in Hong Kong. So you have the national security law passed in 2020. That's been used extensively to crack down on human rights activists, pro-democracy politicians, journalists, human rights lawyers, and others. And that has fundamentally sort of reset the tone for public discussion, political debate in Hong Kong, and sadly not in a good way. What this new law will do will further expand the toolkit that the government has at its disposal to continue to reshape Hong Kong's once vibrant and open society. And I do think, and I hope we'll talk about this a little bit as well, that some of the provisions of the law may focus more on overseas activists, including some of our Hong Konger friends now here in Washington, D.C., who have been lobbying Congress and the Biden administration on human rights in Hong Kong. So there's a lot of new there in addition to some of the provisions that are a bit more familiar.
So today we're coming to the end of the 30-day public consultation period for Article 23. When you look at the Hong Kong government's request for consultations and its own rationale for implementation of Article 23 legislation now, what are your takeaways?
Yeah, Jude, do you want to go? I have a lot to say, but I want
Well, if you look at the proposal, there's a lot of language that you feel very familiar because I studied Chinese law for many years. Just the language such as the use of anti-color revolution, anti-China, all those are directly come from the Chinese law. So you can see that one of the objective is to more align the Hong Kong law with the Chinese law. Just by looking at the language, you can clearly feel the familiarity.
Yeah, can I chime in on that? You mentioned the word rationale, and I think that's where we start to get in a little bit of trouble in terms of what the government is saying about why this law, why now. And as Yaqiu mentioned, you see these references to the 2019 pro-democracy movement being a quote-unquote color revolution. Now, we all know that that's not the case. You had a quite vibrant and energetic pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong in 2019. That was in a moment of opportunity for the Hong Kong government to respond to public demands and engage in a conversation. Instead, they cracked down, and then Beijing cracked down with the 2020 national security law. Now they're saying they need even more laws to deal with the events of 2019. What I think they should do instead is turn the page, right? Now is the time to focus on economic growth, focus on positive engagement with the international community. This takes us in exactly the opposite direction.
My own impression from having been on the ground, I arrived in Hong Kong in the summer of 2019, as the protest movement was beginning, is that of course it's difficult to characterize an entire movement
For sure.
because many people had different interests. But based on my own conversations with Hong Kongers, the vast majority were interested in accountability and making certain government accountability.
Completely agree.
And making certain that Hong Kong maintained the autonomy which they had been promised in the Sino-British Joint Declaration. I believe that the scope and the vehemence of the protests took everyone by surprise. And you have since the second half of 2019 seen an ongoing reaction, first by imposition of the national security law, and then, as we've already discussed, much of the language in the consultation document is quite familiar because it's the longstanding allegations of a color revolution, repeated references to chaos, this interest in imposing stability. There is also repeated mention of concern about Hong Kong independence, which in my own experience was not something that was motivating the protest movement.
I totally agree.
So you have this very strong reaction, first through the national security law, now through the proposed Article 23 legislation. How is the Article 23 legislation going to be different from the national security law? Wouldn't the national security law presumably have been enough? Why is this needed?
That's a very good question. When I was looking at the text, it's espionage, external interferences. It's different words. And in the national security law, it's a collusion, foreign collusion. But what's the difference? Foreign collusion and external interferences. So I think there's a lot of overlap. But by studying it, like Chinese law for over the years, they're just different layers. They have more tools they can use whenever they wanted to use one. So just have more stuff in the toolbox they can use. That's my interpretation.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. But having said that, you can also pick up some of the signaling functions that I think are there with the new law. So I mentioned a minute ago the likely move to focus more on external groups. And we have Chapter 7 of the consultation document that talks about external forces. We have Chapter 5, which talks about the current colonial era official secrets ordinance that's now being expanded into a Beijing-style state secrets law. And I think that points to a desire to have more tools to clamp down on discussion that Hong Kong and perhaps Beijing as well doesn't like. We've seen some of these laws on the mainland be used against business interests up in Beijing and on the mainland. If that kind of legal framework is applied to Hong Kong, I think we're going to have a very real problem, given Hong Kong's history as a vigorous business center with an amazingly rich financial news press, both Chinese and international. So there's a lot that's happening in the law that's expanding, maybe I can put it that way, that is quite troublesome.
So sorry, go ahead.
Just want to chime in. I think there's an incentive for the people who are doing the job in terms of proposing the law, enacting law, in terms of their career advancement. So it's like for them, they wanted to demonstrate to Beijing, I'm really working hard in Hong Kong to exert more control for you. So that's like good for my career advancement. So I think that probably is also behind why they're doing more legislations.
Yes, there is something I observed when I was in Hong Kong was a trend toward performative patriotism.
Yeah.
And making certain that people are seen as conforming to what the current winds are in Beijing. So if I understand it correctly, external interference is a new concept. And is it clearly defined? What does it mean, and how is that likely to be implemented, particularly in a city that's traditionally been such an important international hub?
Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head in terms of very expansive legal language that could be used and perhaps is even designed to cover civil society groups outside of Hong Kong. And I think they're trying to do two things there. One, to make sure that no Hong Kongers still in Hong Kong have contact with these advocacy groups in Washington, London, Brussels, Australia, and elsewhere. And two, to potentially issue arrest warrants against individuals who are doing this work outside of Hong Kong. And that, I think, is very troublesome because it also creates the potential for growing legal conflicts between the United States, for example, and Hong Kong. The United States, the State Department has said that efforts to extend the national security law to U.S. citizens is an affront to U.S. sovereignty. I think that's spot on. And if we're going to see more moves like this under the new national security law, Article 23, national security legislation, then that's going to be leading to more conflict with Washington and probably with other countries as well.
Working in the international NGO space, I know part of my job is to support activists on the ground. I don't know the details what they were putting in the external interferences, but as far as I know, this is a shared concern within the international NGO community. It's already very, very difficult to, in any way, help people on the ground, but we are all worried that it's gonna make the situation even worse.
One of the trends I observed is, and this is very commonly used on the mainland as well, is there's a lack of specificity that creates an atmosphere of self-censorship and possibly coercion, because people may be vaguely aware of what they think the potential red lines are, but they aren't certain. And when you look at the concept of external interference, although what the government may have in mind is NGOs or civil society or foreign government initiatives that they see as troublesome, it could also conceivably be applied to education or other aspects of Hong Kong's international engagement. In my own experience, I found that many people, given the lack of certainty, would sometimes choose simply not to pursue a meeting or a proposal because they just didn't know. Yeah. They weren't confident. When you look at the consultation document, there is also discussion of holistic security. And this is a concept that I think has originated on the mainland. And I wanted to get your perspective on what holistic security means and how it may apply to implementation of the legislation.
Yeah. I think, building on your excellent comments, Hanscom, I think what we have here is a law that's very vague and that can be expanded in all sorts of ways. Now, no doubt, the first targets for this law will be pro-democracy advocates, people who are still trying to revive the ideas of the 2019 protest movement. But given the context, given the concept of holistic security, you could see this law expanded in new ways to go after new targets over time as Beijing's political security needs and assessments evolve. Let me just give you one quick example. So obviously when the NSL went into effect in 2020, we were all grappling with the COVID crisis, and we're all, of course, very sad that our friend Jude is not able to join us here today. COVID is still with us, as we all know. But we have seen the NSL, in particular the colonial era sedition provision, which has acted as a sort of adjunct to the 2020 NSL, be used to target people who are critical of the government's COVID policy. And I have the concern that under this holistic security concept, you'll see the Article 23 laws be used in similarly, if I can use this word, innovative ways. To go after targets that weren't considered sensitive, 6 months before, but now have become more problematic.
I think probably economic policies. China, the economy is not doing well. Inside the mainland, there are a lot of censorship over news that were previously not considered sensitive, like the economy is not doing well, unemployment is high. Now those things, that kind of content are being censored. Hong Kong now the Hong Kong government still wanted to retain the city as the financial center in Asia. It's getting harder and harder to do that if you have this kind of laws that business don't know where the line is. So one worry is that they're gonna expand the definition of national security to include economic policies, economic activities, or certain numbers that concern the economy.
Mm-hmm. Traditionally, common ground between China and the United States on Hong Kong has been maintaining the city as a competitive global hub. That's been enormously beneficial for everyone involved. And again, when you look at the consultation document, the language seems very focused on vague perceived threats to quote-unquote security. There aren't necessarily clear definitions of what these concepts mean. To what extent is the uncertainty of both the legislation itself and the way it may be implemented using, now we have nearly 4 years of experience with the national security law, what does that mean for Hong Kong's business climate and competitiveness as a hub?
You want to go first?
Well, I don't have that much engagement with the business community, but as far as I hear from my friends who work in the companies, everybody's worried. Even they're asking the lawyer, what does that mean? The lawyer basically suggests you to not do anything because anything can be included. I think there's definitely an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty within the business community. Maybe you guys have more experience since you probably have more engagement with that community.
I'll just offer a couple of examples, and I'm sure Hanscom, you'll want to chime in on this as well. The FT has already reported that some law firms in Hong Kong are starting to use burner phones. They are starting to have most of their data storage be done overseas with increased sort of protections for who has access to that data if they're in Hong Kong, all in response to the national security law. And with these Article 23 proposals, we may see more moves like that by the international business community to say, wait a minute, we're not the main target of law, but of course it applies to us. And those kinds of moves suggest to me a level of uncertainty and concern that just wasn't there, let's say, prior to 2019. Maybe just one other quick example. The mainland state secrets law led some companies to say we can't actually disclose corporate information because we may be violating the mainland state secrets law. And that led to a protracted back and forth between the SEC here in Washington and the Chinese securities regulator. Now, if you have the same law in Hong Kong, then that's going to create further barriers to corporate disclosure that is so vital to Hong Kong's status as a business hub.
In my own experience, I found that the business community certainly isn't monolithic, and
Yeah.
you wouldn't expect it to be.
Yeah.
But they had benefited so well and for
Yeah.
so long from Hong Kong's many traditional strengths, including free access to information and
Yeah.
the rule of law. Regardless of how they were interpreted, the protests were devastating, I think, to people who lived through them. And while there are some in the business community who I think are apt to focus on what they would see as surface quote unquote stability and think that these national security issues won't apply to us, and perhaps they haven't. At the same time, I have also in my conversations gotten a sense of growing concern about, again, uncertainty, about the persistence of the predictability and of the rule of law, which has always been one of Hong Kong's strongest selling points. It's interesting if you look at the American Chamber of Commerce's survey of its members about business conditions in Hong Kong, and I think it's the fourth most cited aspect of Hong Kong's competitiveness, and that's the legal and regulatory environment. But at the same time, when companies are asked about their biggest concerns about Hong Kong's lack of competitiveness, the legal and regulatory environment comes in, I think, at number 8. So it's perhaps a double-edged sword increasingly. There is this strong tradition that is becoming increasingly uncertain, and implementation of Article 23 may add to that uncertainty.
Oh, absolutely. Just one other point on this. I mean, I think we have some anecdotal data on this in terms of some smaller Hong Kong firms moving to Singapore. We have, sadly, the performance of the Hang Seng Index not being particularly robust. So there are sort of snapshots that we can look at that suggest that very uncertainty that you're talking about. And I think this Article 23 national security legislation is going to feed that uncertainty, unfortunately.
I heard on the news companies are moving their Asia headquarters to Singapore. Like Singapore, I know, is the biggest beneficiary from the whole crackdown on Hong Kong.
I'm afraid so.
Yeah.
I found that while, with very few exceptions, companies were not leaving, that Hong Kong's relative competitiveness was eroding due to the uncertainty.
The NSO, yeah.
And I think everyone expected that Article 23 would be implemented at some point. Again, this has been pending at least since 2003. However, the initial sense I have is that the proposal raises more questions that affect the competitiveness of the business climate than many people in the business community were expecting. One of the arguments that has been made both in favor of the national security law and now with Article 23 is that many countries, including Western democracies, have this sort of legislation. Hong Kong should as well. With the implication being there shouldn't be so much international concern for Hong Kong doing something that is common globally. Is that a valid parallel to draw?
I think we should all read Tom's paper on that. I think when you read the consultation document, you can feel it's really not a genuine comparison. You can
Yeah. I mean, just a couple of quick thoughts on that. So the consultation document goes to great pains to cite some laws of other countries, including the United States, the UK, Australia, and elsewhere. And at a surface level, of course, it is true that all of these countries, including our own, have national security laws. But they, for the most part, have been much more narrowly tailored to avoid their potential use or even abuse to go after political targets, civil society targets, journalists, and others. I think that even at this late date, there are ways that the Hong Kong government can learn from these comparative examples. Two quick examples. The UK National Security Act that was passed in 2023 has a sort of ombudsperson who reports to the UK Parliament every year on the implementation of the law. And that person is independent of the government and is meant to provide critical insight on how the government is doing in its use of its expanded national security powers. Take Canada, for example. Canada, under its official secrets law, has a public interest exception. So if you're exposing information that is classified and you're a journalist doing it in the public interest, you're shielded from prosecution. And I was glad to note that the Hong Kong Law Society also called for a similar provision in their law. So I think there is more that the Hong Kong government can do to learn from some of these comparative examples and hopefully improve their legislation as this moves forward.
I think the News Association also asked for a public
that's right.
interest provision
I think that's
as
right.
well. So you're seeing aspects of Hong Kong civil society raising some of these concerns.
Yeah.
Are the parallels with foreign national security laws valid?
Well, yes and no. So, you have some of these, let's take a step back. Even if the U.S. has on its books, which of course it does, laws that could be improved, we know that when they're applied, the courts are going to rigorously look at their application to any individual case, any individual criminal defendant, and say, wait a minute, what are you doing here? And we're going to read this law sort of in the context of this person's basic constitutional rights. Now, we've just had in the United States a series of national security prosecutions in relation to the January 6th attack on our Congress, right? January 6th, 2021. I live a mile from U.S. Congress, and I was at home on January 6th, 2021. So I know that when you have things like that happen, you need laws that are there to deal with them. But in each and every case, the individuals who were prosecuted had their sort of full complement of due process rights. They had their full complement of due process rights, and no one was prosecuted merely for engaging in peaceful political speech. And so those are some of the sort of institutional dynamics that are here in the U.S. context, but sadly aren't really working in Hong Kong right now. We've had something like 200 national security law prosecutions, and we have a 100% conviction rate for the government. That suggests to me that the Hong Kong courts haven't figured out a way to balance national security concerns and human rights. I'd love for them to be able to be more active with Article 23 prosecutions when they come down the line, but that prior experience makes me concerned.
I wouldn't say the U.S. Or UK national security laws are perfect, but I feel there's a fundamental difference in the sense the U.S. or UK national security law. I think the primary goal is really to address national security issue. The national security law in Hong Kong, Article 23. I think the primary goal is more about cracking down on fundamental freedom and human rights. So from the very start, the laws are different. Mm-hmm. The intent are different. Yeah.
And I think the Hong Kong News Association made a very important point that you can safeguard national security at the same time as you protect the rights that were, in Hong Kong's case, guaranteed by the basic law. It's not a zero-sum game. You can do both.
Absolutely.
Whereas the perspective of the national security legislation, in my own experience, was quite different. When the law was rolled out in 2020, first of all, this was not a law that was developed within Hong Kong, and part of the public selling of the law stressed that the law is only going to apply to a small number of people. Well, when you come from a rule of law tradition, by definition, that means the law applies equally to everyone. And so when legislation is described as only applied to a small number of people, I think it reveals a mindset of rule by law as opposed to rule of law. And when you look at the consultation language, we've talked about holistic security. We've talked about this new concept of external interference. We've seen the reappearance of much of the language in different formats related to quote unquote foreign forces. All of these suggest an ongoing insecurity or concern about exerting control in a way that is very different from what we've seen in Hong Kong in the past.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, one of the virtues of Hong Kong has been its open, robust, and freewheeling culture, right? If you're a government official in Hong Kong, at least prior to the 2020 NSL, you're going to take your licks in the public space, and that's the way it should be. Certainly politicians in the United States know that if they go into the arena, they're going to be criticized, and sometimes, impolitic, if I can use that word, language is going to be used. What we're seeing in Hong Kong now is a much lower degree of tolerance for robust, open political debate and criticism. And sadly, I think the Article 23 national security legislation is going to add to this problem. We haven't talked yet about Chapter 4 of the consultation document on expanding sedition to include Hong Kong's legislature, the LegCo. That to me is a signal that Hong Kong government is saying, hey, we know that a lot of you don't like the performance of our new non-democratically selected legislative council, but be careful what you say, because we do have a new tool here to penalize people who engage in speech that we feel crosses the line.
I mean, if you look at the history of the prosecutions under the national security law, so the crimes ordinance, the sedition article, so many are clearly freedom of speech issues. You say a slogan, you wear a T-shirt says "Liberty Hong Kong." Those are, clearly free speech within the realm of freedom of expression on the international human rights law. So just by looking at the history, you know the intent of the national security law, and you can, infer the intent of Article 23.
Yeah, absolutely.
So based on what we've seen, certainly since 2020, what is implementation likely to mean, not just for Hong Kong's viability and success, which is, again, has always been common ground between the international community and Beijing, but also what does it mean for ordinary Hong Kongers?
Well, I think language like inducing hatred towards the Chinese government, I think it's like, what does that even mean? Like, in what? If you criticize the government, it can be deemed as inducing hatred towards the government. So I think even for ordinary people, language like that is very scary. Even you're not in the job of doing journalism or, of academic who studies political science, even because everybody wants to express some opinions of the government. So I think the fear is pervasive among the population. And I have friends, I lived in Hong Kong when you were the Consul General. I have friends who are completely not in the field of journalism or academia or human rights law, but they don't want to live there anymore. They don't want their children to grow up in Hong Kong anymore. They don't want to live in this society that fears pervasive that you have to engage in self-censorship. It's just not a place you want to live, even if you don't have a job that is anything related to politics.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with that. And maybe if I can just take a quick step backward from the moment of implementation, which I think you're right, we're all going to have our eyes on. But even during this consultation phase and the legislative drafting phase, there's a real moment of opportunity here for the Hong Kong government to take these recommendations seriously. We talked about the Hong Kong Law Society. You mentioned some of the news media organizations that have chimed in with very good proposals. Certainly Georgetown has put our 2 cents in terms of ways we think the law can be, proposals can be improved. So if the Hong Kong government takes those proposals seriously and scales back some of the problematic elements of the law, that would send a really strong signal. Now, I'm not betting on that. I wouldn't put even money on it, but one can still hope Now, turning to implementation, I think the one key element to watch will be what are the courts able to do, right? Will there be a bit of a split between how the courts have handled the national security law, the 2020 national security law, with the 100% conviction rate, and how they handle Article 23 criminal prosecutions? If we see some not guilty verdicts coming out of the courts, and we see acceptance of those not guilty verdicts from the government, that too would be a sign that there is an effort to try to turn the page here.
I appreciate, of course, I mean, the Asia Law Center has submitted the recommendation. I appreciate NGOs doing this work. At least then John Lee doesn't have the excuse saying, see, nobody is criticizing me, right? So, however, I don't have high hopes just by looking at the Hong Kong government's record and look at Beijing's record. So I feel there needs to be more pressure from the international community. The U.S. government so far is the only one that has, imposed the sanctions towards the people who are involved in the drafting and enact of the national security law. I think there needs to be more sanctions towards the people who are involved in Article 3. If they have assets abroad, the foreign governments has the power to freeze their assets. There needs to be more done in the international community to address the Hong Kong issue. That's all stem from that I don't have much hope for the Hong Kong government itself, but I appreciate your efforts.
We have to try. We have to try.
Hong Kong has gone through an incredibly difficult several years. I think it's important to remember that while in many cases Hong Kong today is very different from the Hong Kong of 2019, it also continues to retain significant differences from the mainland. And I think many Hong Kongers I know, whether they are still in Hong Kong or abroad, are very focused on trying to maintain what's left, to hold that space, to let Hong Kong, for lack of a better word, be itself. Because that is not just the Hong Kong they want to live in, as you said, but ultimately it affects Hong Kong's bottom line, Hong Kong's viability, because it has been such a successful hub for business. Can you think of a parallel of a developed service economy with an uncertain legal system that could potentially affect whether it's free flows of information or consistent, reliable access to due process and the rule of law?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, for me, one of the constant reminders in the work that we've done on the national security law since it went into effect in 2020, and certainly this work on Article 23, is look at how robust the system was between 1997 and 2019. And as somebody who works on both Hong Kong and on the mainland, you're absolutely right that those differences are all too clear. So I think the Hong Kong government needs to recognize, okay, how do we get back to a place where we're emphasizing the distinctiveness of our system? We are communicating our support for that distinctiveness and Hong Kong's autonomy under the basic law to both our own people and to the international community. And that's a path forward that I think we can all get behind. And this Article 23 proposal is sadly not a step in that direction.
I mean, Hong Kong is not just a financial center to me. I grew up in the mainland. I listened to Cantonese pop. I watched the Hong Kong movie. And the reason there's just such a variety of cultural products has so much to do with the city is free, so you can freely express your artistic creativity. And that's very important. It's not just about business. People want to live there. People admire you, not just because you make money, you're rich. It's also because you have produced so much cultural products. And I do think John Lee wants that too, right? That is part of the prestige of Hong Kong as a city.
It's Hong Kong's traditionally soft power.
Yes,
as an entity, as Asia's world city. And that status, again, is something that everyone has always wanted and supported. And to me, there isn't a template or an obvious template for an advanced international hub on any front, whether it's finance, which is most commonly associated with Hong Kong, but culturally as well, that has a combination of a very advanced service economy and this degree of growing legal uncertainty. I think that's the key question, because even if you haven't been affected directly, in my own conversations, there are many people who simply have less confidence that that will be the case in the future, or they're wasting time worrying about it because they don't know. And that's, among other things, not good for business.
Oh, I totally agree. And I think, again, I still hold out some hope. And here, Yaqiu and I have a slight disagreement in terms of whether or not these proposals can be improved so that there is an easier path back to a focus on all those distinctive elements in Hong Kong. And there is even some low-hanging fruit in the consultation document proposals, right? They have some due process provisions in there, even things relating to seizure of passports. If you take those provisions out, that's going to improve the law, and people are going to notice. And that's going to be sending a signal to, I think, to Hong Kongers, the international community, and mainland Chinese friends who are watching these events unfold in Hong Kong, to sort of say, hey, we get it, we're listening. That's where I think the government's efforts need to go in the next month or two as they move forward with the legislative drafting phase.
Yeah, because so much of it, as we said before, in looking at the international parallels, is context.
Yeah.
So in the United States, in the United Kingdom,
Yeah.
Many other jurisdictions that have been cited, there are the checks and balances that are able to produce national security legislation that is effective but also accountable. And in my own experience, so much of the 2019 unrest in Hong Kong was simply motivated by a desire for government accountability. And when we look at the consultation document, some of the most troubling aspects are either lack of clarity, because there aren't precise definitions of some of the concepts. We've seen that with security, holistic security, or confidence that there are going to be the mechanisms for transparency and accountability that have made Hong Kong so successful
Totally
in the
agree.
past. One interesting question, and this has come up multiple times, and when I was in Hong Kong, I was also the Consul General to Macau. And Macau, also a former foreign colony with in some ways a similar format, special administrative region. So to what extent do you think the mainland may be modeling its approach to Hong Kong on what we've already seen in Macau, which is a jurisdiction that gets less attention,
Much
but
less attention, yeah.
has a different legal tradition, but in some ways a very different but very successful economy, and has its own national security legislation.
Sure. I mean, I'll say a word or two, and again, I think Yaqiu will want to chime in. I mean, I think two vibrant, wonderful places. Of course, I've spent time in Macau as well, and I always enjoy my time there. But let's face it, the economic models are very different. And I think the political needs of the sort of economic model in Hong Kong are such that any move by Beijing to sort of say, hey, let's learn some lessons from the Macau context, that wouldn't be the right approach for Hong Kong. Again, we have, as you're saying, Hanscom, a really great model here in the basic law itself. I tell my students at Georgetown, between 1997 and let's say 2014, I would give Beijing a B+ for its approach to honoring its commitments under the basic law. Now, they don't get an A, but I'm old enough to remember when the B plus is a good grade. And so I think that, there is a template, let me put it that way, for Beijing to take a fresh look at, to get back to a better place in Hong Kong. And it's right there before them with the basic law itself.
I think to Beijing, to an extent, it's a trial and error because I don't think they expected the 2019 protests were so huge. Then they came down with such an overwhelming force within the national security law. So I think they are observing too, in terms of how to control this population when the resistance and frustration, anger was so much. I mean, now it's kind of tamed down because of just the forceful nature of the national security law. But I'm sure there will be flare-ups because it's inside people, and you can't control. People's wanting for freedom is innate. And they had experienced freedom for decades and decades. It's just not going to die so easily.
No, I agree. I think that you were in Hong Kong in 2019 as well, and I think everyone was startled. Hong Kongers themselves,
Absolutely.
certainly Beijing, certainly the United States. No one saw this coming, and unfortunately, the reaction was very reactionary, for lack of a better word. And again, we see this in the consultation document with the relentless return to the language that characterized the protest era of color revolutions. Now, this sort of language, I think, is often used. I heard it when I was living on the mainland during the Occupy Central movement, for example. In this case, based on my own experience, not only is the language the same, but it is accompanied by an underlying belief that this is the case. The mainland is acting from a sense that the protests were motivated by quote unquote foreign forces. And so if that is your mistaken belief, the way you're going to address the problem is fundamentally different. And that's what we're seeing. I think that ultimately the interest is political control and quote unquote stability. But the question is, to what extent is any of that compatible with what Hong Kongers want and what they were promised? And also, much more practically, Hong Kong's competitiveness and strength as a business hub. So what is the breaking point? As we look at implementation, again, based on a relatively limited experience since the national security law was imposed, what are some of the indicators we should be looking for as to whether or not the pendulum is finally swinging in another direction? I found when I was in Hong Kong, there was a great deal of fatalism. People thought, okay, there's nothing we can do now, and eventually Beijing is going to decide we'll move in a different direction. But what should we be looking for?
Go ahead, Yaqiu.
I think I like to talk about hope because I am hopeful. A big indicator is within mainland China, the economy not doing well, the aging population, the high unemployment, the population decline. Those are the things even the powerful CCP can't really reverse when you're facing such a population decline, when the economy is in such a bad shape. So that definitely will affect Beijing's ability in terms of exert control, whether it's in mainland or in Hong Kong. So, I mean, I don't want anybody to suffer economically inside the country. I have family members in China. But it takes away power from Beijing when you're not economically that powerful anymore. This is one. The other is that, especially by observing young people, they don't want to participate in this economic development model the government has been propagate. You hand in some of my rights, your rights, I will guarantee economic growth for you. People don't buy into that much anymore. So ideologically, I think it's kind of losing its appeal, Beijing, at least within the mainland. In terms, I think another big aspect is international environment. That has changed so much. in the past 5 or 10 years. I think the world has decidedly waken up to the CCP's authoritarianism, not just within China, its intention to undermine human rights and democracy globally, and the world, especially Western country, has, promulgated the laws to address this issue. So the international political environment has changed so much, and I do think, the Chinese government cares about that a lot.
No, I think that's absolutely right, and I think there are a couple of other elements to watch as we see how the Hong Kong government implements this law. So how will the Hong Kong government use its new administrative powers under the law? How often will they cancel individuals' passports, as I mentioned a minute ago? How willing will they be to let individuals accused of national security crimes go out on bail? Right? How often will they sort of avoid any moves that would put a criminal defendant at a disadvantage vis-a-vis the prosecution? Then from Beijing's perspective, one of the things, of course, that we've seen under the national security law is the use of pro-Beijing media outlets in Hong Kong to send a signal to the Hong Kong courts: this person is guilty. If they refrain from that kind of activity, which I think is unfortunate, as these Article 23 national security cases move forward, that would be a positive signal, I think, that the judiciary would pick up on, that they would be able to say, okay, we can adjudicate these cases on the basis of law and on the basis of constitutional rights protections. So there are moves that can be made that would hopefully improve the implementation of this law, and I think those are some of the things to look for as we go forward.
And then what are some practical ways the international community writ large, not only governments, but civil society, business, everyone, whether they're in Hong Kong as well, because one of Hong Kong's great strengths is its openness. The fact that compared to most other foreign cities I've lived and worked in, people aren't there for 2 or 3 years, they're there for 20 or 30 years because they're really part of the city. What can people do practically to bring Hong Kong closer to what it's always been, that has, again, been such common ground and has benefited everyone?
I think within the NGO world, the civil society, human rights organizations, I'm from the mainland. I just felt I have so much experience to offer to Hong Kong in the sense of how do you survive and continue to the fight under this very repressive environment. I mean, the human rights activists in China have been fighting the fight for decades, and we're still doing it. And like psychologically or mentally, how do you stay strong? It's important when you're in that space when the environment is so hard. So just sharing experience. And there's a way you can continue your fight. It's even when it's not that you can no longer be that on that surface. You can no longer organize protests as we see in 2019. The fight you can still do something about it. And I know Tom is extremely supportive to Hong Kong activists. Continue to fight even within the diaspora. I absolutely see the diaspora. A lot of people have fled Hong Kong. The activists, journalists, they're definitely organizing in the U.S., in the U.K., everywhere. They're forging an alliance outside of Hong Kong to support the cause in Hong Kong.
Oh, absolutely. And I should mention, I probably should have mentioned this at the top, that our consultation document is a collaborative product between myself and some top Hong Kong lawyers who are now based outside of Hong Kong, the group of us worked together to put this document together. And I certainly was the beneficiary of their deep expertise on all of these legal issues and, of course, on the comparative elements as well. And I do think that speaks to the opportunities that the international academic community has to engage with some of the Hong Kongers who have left Hong Kong and to view them as colleagues, friends, partners on work on Hong Kong. Having said that, I also think certainly academic institutions like Georgetown have deep ties to academic institutions in Hong Kong, including Hong Kong U, including CUHK and the others, and we want to keep those ties going because isolating these academic institutions only serves to make them less resilient and less able to make it through this difficult period. One last point, if I may, I do think the U.S. government has an opportunity to be forthright about the problems with this law and offer up some current criticisms and concerns. I mentioned some of the previous State Department statements that have been there. They have a great record on this, and I hope they continue to speak out on both this proposal document and legislation when it moves forward.
I think it's key that you mentioned the extensive networks that Hong Kong people and Hong Kong institutions have always enjoyed with the outside world. We shouldn't take those for granted, and we should make certain that we remain engaged in a way that is constructive and helpful to help preserve what remains in Hong Kong and what has always made Hong Kong so vibrant and competitive. I lived in Hong Kong for 3 years, and although I was there at an extremely difficult time and had visited many times, I didn't appreciate everything that Hong Kong had until I actually was on the ground, of course. Yeah. And for everyone who loves Hong Kong and appreciates the Hong Kong model, as challenging as it is to see what the city has undergone over the last several years, as you said, Yaqiu, I think that there always has to be a basis for hope. Totally agree. Because, as you said, Tom, for so long, one country, two systems actually worked extremely well to everyone's benefit. We have a successful model in place, and it's based on autonomy. And that's something that I think everyone was able to agree on in the past. And I hope that as we look at the formulation and implementation, not just of this legislation, but so much of what's been happening in post-2019 Hong Kong, that we're able to return to much of that that common ground. And I was in Hong Kong not only during the protests, but during COVID. And it's also encouraging to see the city start to reopen physically.
Yeah, I agree. Completely agree.
So I think this is an ongoing conversation. It's important not to, in my view, write Hong Kong off, but instead to look very closely at what is happening there in ways that allow for Hong Kong to leverage its strengths and return, as I said, to something that more closely approaches the model that used to work, so well.
I mean, just to build on that closing point, I know we're almost out of time, but I genuinely, and I know my Hong Konger friends that I worked together with on this document would agree with this sentiment. Our proposals are constructive proposals to help the Hong Kong government formulate national security legislation that won't violate human rights. And I know that all of the other proposals that are being put in from the international groups and from our friends in Hong Kong are meant in a similar vein to help Hong Kong get past this difficult moment. So I hope the Hong Kong government will take that on board.
My last word is that I believe in the Hong Kong people. I was there in 2019. Millions of people went to the street. It brought me to tears. And the yearning for freedom is innate. It didn't die. It's still within people's heart, and it will erupt someday. So I believe in Hong Kong people.
Well, many thanks to Tom Kellogg from the Georgetown Center for Asian Law, Yaqiu Wang, Research Director for China at Freedom House, and thanks to all of you for joining us in today's conversation. Thank you.